Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about humanitarian interventions in Edexcel A Level Politics. I'm going to start by having a look at the parts of the specification this video covers, and some key 12-marker questions and 30-marker questions you could get asked on this topic in the exam. From there, I'm going to start on the content and have a look at the rise of humanitarian interventions in the 1990s in particular, looking not only at a number of case studies of humanitarian interventions, both successful and unsuccessful, but also at the reasons why humanitarian interventions became so common in the post-Cold War period. From there, I'm going to look at humanitarian interventions in the 21st century, and in particular, the reasons for the decline in humanitarian interventions in the last 15 years in particular. I'm then crucially going to give you some key arguments you can use in your essays in relation to humanitarian interventions, looking at three key arguments that they do promote human rights, and three arguments they don't promote human rights, and actually, in many cases, can be seen as harming human rights, before finally taking a quick look at the role of civil society in promoting human rights. The notes you can see on your screen are part of an updated textbook on the Global Politics section of the Edexcel A Level Politics Specification that you can purchase on the Politics Explained website, where you can also find loads of other resources to help you in your Politics A Level, including global politics, essay plans and 12 marker plans, as well as detailed essay plans covering every single part of the course. The same is true of the updated textbooks, and there's also a place to sign up for tutoring or some live revision webinars we're doing before this year's exams if you're interested. Yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off with the parts of specification this video covers. So this is the second of 4 videos on the channel on the third subtopic of global politics. So that's global governance, human rights and environmental. So make sure to watch the one on human rights courts before having a look at this one. And those two, this previous one on human rights courts and this video together cover the kind of human rights part of the specification. So we're going to have a look at the rise of humanitarian interventions and growth in the 1990s. With a lot of examples, as I said, and look at reasons for selective interventionism, the development of the responsibility to protect, and conflict with state sovereignty, as well as examples of alleged Western double standards and hypocrisy. And we're going to look in particular actually at the war on terror as an example and the consequences that had for the decline of humanitarian interventions in the subsequent period. And then quickly, it's not completely linked to this, but we're going to have a final look at the end of the video at the role of civil society and non-state actors in addressing human rights. So that's another part of the specification. In terms of the 12 markers and 30 markers you can see on your screen, of course, just pause to have a look at all of them. All of the ones in bold are part of the 12 marker plans or 30 marker plans on the Politics Explained website. And if you know and plan these ones in detail and know the content in them really well, you should not only be able to answer these questions, which are some of the most likely ones to come up in the exam, you should also be able to kind of adapt the content and the arguments to answer almost every question that's going to come up in the exam in the summer. So in terms of some possible 12 markers you could get on this content, I think it's less likely you get it on this compared to courts because they make quite a lot of sense in terms of comparing institutions, but you could definitely look at the similar criticisms of humanitarian interventions and human rights courts, or you could look at the differences between them potentially in their effectiveness. So they're the kind of 12 markers you can get. I think it's likely it would be a comparison to human rights courts, but you could get different questions as well. On the 30 marker questions, these are going to be really useful on a lot of human rights questions. So for example, you could bring them in on a comparison of human rights courts and whether they're better at protecting human rights compared to humanitarian interventions. You could get a question just on humanitarian interventions and whether they're effective in protecting human rights, or a question such as that one at the top on the relationship between sovereignty and human rights, whether sovereignty is potentially the biggest barrier. And a lot of the content you can be bringing in there is from this video on humanitarian interventions. So let's start with the content. So first, looking at the rise of humanitarian interventions in the 1990s. So humanitarian interventions are military actions undertaken by states or international organisations, but crucially, if an international organisation is acting, it's through a coalition of states, that are justified by preventing widespread human suffering, often in the context of severe human rights violations such as genocide, ethnic cleansing and mass violence. So global politics in the 1990s was really dominated by a number of these interventions. They're military interventions designed to protect human rights because a state is violating the human rights of its citizens, and the international community or a number of countries have decided they need to intervene militarily and stop the states doing what it's doing to protect the human rights of its citizens. They became really common in the 1990s for a number of reasons. Crucial was the geopolitical context of the end of the Cold War and the dominance of liberal democracy. So the conclusion of the Cold War in 1991 was a really big turning point in international relations. The dissolution of the Soviet Union eliminated the fact that the world previously was geopolitically dominated by a competition between two main powers, where in each kind of local conflict they take either side, and there were a lot of proxy conflicts in the world. And it brought about a new era of unipolarity, where the US exerted significant influence in shaping global norms and policies. It saw liberal democracy as the most effective and stable form of governance, and at the time there was very little questioning of this. So it was so dominant that other actors weren't really able to question the dominance of US values of liberal democracy and human rights. And because it was unipolar and the US was so strong, it was able to really spread these values across the world, of democracy and human rights in particular. So under Bill Clinton, the US advocated for humanitarian interventions both as a moral responsibility and a strategic interest to ensure global stability, even if this undermined the sovereignty of states. We're going to look a lot at the questions of state sovereignty as it relates to humanitarian interventions as we go through the video. And the dominant belief was really that humanitarian interventions were necessary to maintain global peace and security, even if they limited the sovereignty of states. Crucially, at the time, because of this unipolarity and the dominance of US ideas and values, and kind of the inability of other states to question that, or unwillingness of other states to question that, the UN security authorised a lot of these humanitarian interventions. During the Cold War, and actually in the last 15 years, the UN Security Council, as we looked at in the United Nations, has been very gridlocked. It was gridlocked between the United States or in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, when if the United States had wanted to do any of these interventions, and that they'd be authorised by the UN Security Council, would simply have been blocked or vetoed, by the Soviet Union. Since the same's occurred with Russia and China in the last 15 years. But in the post-Cold War era, there was actually a bit of a sweet spot where the Soviet Union had collapsed, Russia was much less powerful, and in some ways aligned with the United States, and that meant that there were no vetoes from the P5 members on the Security Council, and the UN Security Council authorised a lot of these humanitarian interventions. And crucial also, some of them started before this, but the failure to intervene in the Rwandan genocide also was a real motivator from then on. So the 1994 Rwandan genocide was a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of international inaction. So in just 100 days, 800,000 people were killed, whilst the global community, including the UN, largely stood by. We're going to look at this in a little bit more detail in a moment. And the inability to prevent or halt the genocide really led to widespread criticism of countries and international organisations, and therefore led to a commitment from then on that actually state sovereignty needed to be eroded in many cases to protect human rights. So we're going to have a look at a large number of cases now of humanitarian interventions. You don't need to know all of these. You don't need to use all of them in your essays. Definitely don't. But I thought I'd give you the choice so that the ones that you were taught in class, I'll give you a bit of detail on here as well. What I'd really recommend is picking some of the successful ones and some of the unsuccessful ones, which I've colour-coded, and you'll obviously know as I explain them as well. So the first key intervention was in Somalia, and this can be seen as an unsuccessful intervention. So it began in 1992 when the country was in the midst of a civil war, which caused widespread famine and the collapse of central government. The UN Security Council authorised Operation Restore Hope, led by the United States, to facilitate humanitarian aid and stabilise the situation. It involved around 28,000 troops at its peak and was significant for being kind of one of the first post-Cold War missions aimed at addressing international state collapse. It really had mixed outcomes. So initially, the presence of US forces helped to distribute aid and reduce the immediate humanitarian crisis and famine. However, it soon faced severe challenges due to the complexity of the conflicts and resistance from local actors. It escalated in 1993 with the infamous Battle of Mogadishu, which resulted in deaths of 18 US soldiers and hundreds of Somali casualties, and this led to public outcry and the eventual withdrawal of American and UN forces by 1995. It was ultimately, therefore, unsuccessful, failed to create lasting stability or a functioning government. And actually, when we look at the African Union, when we look at regional organisations in subtopic 5, you'll see that there was actually a subsequent intervention by the African Union that was a lot more successful in bringing stability to Somalia. So as one of the first interventions, it was ultimately unsuccessful in maintaining peace. Or kind of not maintaining peace, sorry, bringing peace and stability. Next intervention that was more successful, which also had UN Security Council intervention, authorization, was in Bosnia. So it was initiated in response to the violent breakup of Yugoslavia, which led to ethnic cleansing and widespread atrocities, particularly against Bosniak Muslims. The conflicts really reached its height with the Srebrenica massacre in 1995, where over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were killed by Bosnian Serb forces. And the UN, as a result, established a protection force to protect humanitarian aid routes and civilian safe areas. But it was criticised at the time for its inability to prevent major massacres. NATO did eventually intervene, though, after this, including strategic airstrikes, and shifted the balance and pressured parties into peace negotiations. And it ended the conflict with the Dayton Accord in 1995, which established a framework for lasting peace and the partitioning of Bosnia. So this intervention by NATO, authorised by the UN, was largely successful, demonstrating how the military power of NATO could force parties to the negotiating table and bring about the end to a conflict. The next case study we're going to have a look at in more detail is actually the failure, so the lack of a humanitarian intervention in Rwanda in genocide in 1994. As I said, it was a humanitarian crisis of an unprecedented scale, with approximately 800,000, primarily Tutsi, but also moderate Hutu, who were killed in just 100 days in Rwanda. Despite real warnings from UN officials and NGOs about impending violence, there was a real lack of international response. The UN assistance mission for Rwanda was already present in the country, but was really constrained and had a very limited mandate, and it only had 270 peacekeepers, so it was very able to do very little. And the failure of the international community to act was really decisive in creating the subsequent responsibility to protect doctrine that we'll go through in a bit, but really argued that actually there needed to be violation of state sovereignty in order to protect human rights. And also led to a greater number of humanitarian interventions afterwards. One of these was in Kosovo, and this was actually without UN Security Council authorization. So it was escalating violence in 1999 between the Serbian government and ethnic Albanian Kosovans seeking independence, and reports of mass atrocities and ethnic cleansing led to a strong response from the international community. So NATO launched a 78-day bombing campaign. As I said, this was without UN Security Council intervention against Yugoslav forces, bypassing the UN Security Council because it would have been vetoed by Russia and China. And the intervention ultimately forced the withdrawal of troops from Kosovo, leading to a UN-administered peacekeeping mission. And NATO's action was really controversial because of the lack of UN Security Council authorization, but it was justified on humanitarian grounds and ultimately seen as largely successful due to halting the large-scale violence. Last couple we're going to have a look at then are the successful humanitarian intervention with UN Security Council authorization in East Timor, and this was largely led by Australia. So East Timor's struggle for independence from Indonesia was marked by severe violence and human rights abuses. Pro-Indonesian militias, which kind of had support from elements of the Indonesian military, conducted a brutal campaign of retribution. And the international community, led by Australia and backed by the UN Security Council, intervened to the international force for East Timor. The mission successfully restored order, facilitated humanitarian aid and a transition to peace, and it was widely considered to be successful due to strong regional support, effective leadership, and clear UN authorization, and showed the effectiveness of rapid, well-coordinated interventions against state actors committing human rights violations. The final successful one then to have a look at is Sierra Leone. We saw widespread atrocities in the civil war, including the use of child soldiers. And in 1999, the UN authorized the deployment of the UNAMSIL, the United Nations mission in Sierra Leone, to oversee the peace process and disarm combatants. But it really struggled due to its limited mandate and resistance from the RUF, so the Revolutionary United Front. So this peacekeeping mission really failed. But the intervention then gained momentum when British forces intervened in 2000 to stabilise the situation and protect the capital. And the British operation, combined with strengthened UN efforts, effectively defeated the RUF and restored government control. And is considered successful due to its combination of international and national efforts that led to disarmament, peace, and the establishment of the Special Court for Sierra Leone to prosecute those responsible for war crimes. And that was one of the international criminal tribunals we looked at in the previous video. So yeah, as I said, a large number of case studies. I've read all of the interventions in the period, some with UN authorization, some without UN authorization. But yeah, you can use some of those in your essays as examples, and it's useful just to have that context of the picture as well. What we're going to have a look at now is humanitarian interventions, or lack of humanitarian interventions, and how things developed in the 21st century. And the start of this is the responsibility to protect doctrine, which is developed in response to the humanitarian failures of the 1990s, in particular the Rwandan genocide, where international inaction allowed mass atrocities to occur. And the responsibility to protect sets out that a nation state has a responsibility to protect the human rights of their own citizens, and if they don't and aren't able to do so, and if they threaten them, other states have a responsibility, so the international community has a responsibility to protect their citizens and override the sovereignty of that nation state to do so. And it emphasizes that military intervention should only be pursued as a last resort, but can be pursued and can override sovereignty when doing so. It was formally endorsed by the United Nations in 2005 during the World Summit, where global leaders agreed on the principle that states have a responsibility to protect their population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So it really had that United Nations legitimacy as well. As we'll see, the responsibility to protect has largely not been used due to changes in the international community and global politics, away from the unipolarity, or such strong unipolarity at least, of the 1990s. But despite that, it's still really significant, and it created a really critical shift in international law by eroding the traditional concept of absolute state sovereignty, establishing that sovereignty was actually conditional on a state's ability and willingness to protect the human rights of its citizens. And if it either failed in this responsibility or was the perpetrator, it actually forfeited its immunity from external interference. So it was really significant in relation to the place of sovereignty in international law. Despite its theoretical significance, it was rarely explicitly invoked, as I said, in major interventions during the 2000s and early 2010s, such as in Iraq or Libya, where humanitarian arguments were made, but without formal reference to the responsibility to protect. A crucial development in the 2000s that we'll see is one of the important reasons for the decline in humanitarian interventions in the subsequent decades is the War on Terror. So the War on Terror was initiated by the United States following 9/11, and it marked a really significant shift in US foreign policy. Its primary focus was to, at least what it said its primary focus was to combat terrorism and prevent future attacks, and it led to large-scale military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. Unlike previous humanitarian interventions that primarily aimed to protect human rights and prevent mass atrocities that were more limited interventions, the War on Terror was driven by national security concerns, so it wasn't really a humanitarian intervention. So they were framed as preemptive measures to dismantle terrorist networks such as Al-Qaeda and prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So they, in themselves, are key national security concerns, but there are also other reasons for those interventions, often actually tied up with energy and oil at the time as well. Crucially, there was a lack of UN authorization for these interventions, particularly for Iraq. So the invasions that characterized the War on Terror, particularly Iraq in 2003, were not authorized by the United Nations Security Council, which was crucial. This was not only due to anticipated vetoes from China and Russia, but also because the US intervention had little basis in international law, and that led even some of its allies, such as France, to oppose the intervention. This was really significant, the lack of UN endorsement, as it marked a departure from the post-Cold War norm of seeking multilateral consensus for military interventions, which obviously in the post-Cold War period was a lot easier for the United States, because it was so unipolar and China were much weaker and Russia were much weaker than they were at this time. Even though they're still weak at this time in comparison to what they are today, they had grown in power significantly. This not only undermined the legitimacy of the invasion of Iraq in particular, it also damaged the United States' reputation, as it had claimed to support the liberal international order and upheld international law. But it clearly demonstrated here that it doesn't care about that if that international law and that international order prevents it from doing what it wants to do. Despite the clear strategic and security-driven motives of the War on Terror, the US government did also frequently use humanitarian language to try and justify it. This narrative included rhetoric about liberating oppressed populations, promoting democracy, and protecting human rights. In the case of Iraq, Bush framed the war as a means to free the Iraqi people from a brutal dictatorship that committed severe human rights violations, which it definitely had, including the use of chemical weapons against its own citizens and the persecution of the Kurds and Shiites. However, this co-opting of humanitarian rhetoric was used to try and bolster domestic and international support, even though the primary motives weren't humanitarian. They were largely strategic and security oriented. Crucially, the war on terror, and Iraq in particular, did a great deal of damage to the reputation of the United States and humanitarian interventions as a whole. The prolonged conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan did significant damage, and central to this was reports of human rights abuses, and the use of torture in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib prison, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail. And this really eroded the credibility of the United States as a global leader in the protection of human rights, which it framed itself as in the 1990s. An estimated 200,000 Iraqi civilians were killed during the Iraq War, and crucially, there was an absence of discovered weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which were the US's justification for intervention, which proved to be a lie. And this crucially undermined the justification for the invasion and reinforced the perception that humanitarian arguments were actually used as a cover for their own strategic objectives, including in relation to oil. The unilateral nature of these interventions and their devastating consequences tainted the image of humanitarian intervention as a positive means to protect human rights in the long term, and really damaged the United States' reputation. I'm gonna feel free to pause the video and have a look at this case study of US human rights violations in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib prison. I spoke about that in a little bit in detail as well in the previous video on human rights course, so I'm not going to go through again, but feel free to have a read through. Crucially, there was one humanitarian intervention since kind of 2005 though, and that was in Libya. So I'll just include this one as well, and this was without UN Security Council authorization. So the Libya intervention in 2011 was triggered by escalating violence during the Arab Spring, where Gaddafi threatened large-scale violence and civilian massacres in cities like Benghazi. And it led to UN Security Council Resolution 1973, authorizing all necessary measures to protect civilians. Sorry, I think I said it was without UN Security Council authorization. It was with UN Security Council authorization. And this led to a NATO-led military campaign. So NATO led the campaign, and it successfully prevented a massacre in Benghazi and contributed to the overthrow of Gaddafi's regime. While it was initially praised for its swift response and alignment with the responsibility to protect doctrine, the lack of post-conflict strategy, though, led to ongoing stability and power struggles, and that's why I've coloured it in orange. On the one hand, it prevented immediate massacres, but there's been significant instability and conflict in Libya since the intervention, due to the kind of failure to bring long-term peace. So that was the kind of development of humanitarian interventions in the 2000s. In particular, what you see is the war on terror having a big impact on the lack of humanitarian interventions afterwards. What we're going to look at now is humanitarian intervention in the past 15 years, so particularly kind of since 2011, and look at three key reasons for the decline in humanitarian interventions. The first and most important one are those two men there, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, and that's the growth in power of countries that oppose any violations of state sovereignty, including Russia, but in particular China. And over the past 15 years, you've seen the rise in power of China and Russia, both economically, but also geopolitically, and in terms of their assertiveness in international affairs. And that's really impacted the global willingness to pursue humanitarian interventions. Both countries have been really strong supporters of the principle of state sovereignty and are really opposed to any international interventions that violate state sovereignty, even to protect human rights under the responsibility to protect doctrine. So they'd be opposed to that doctrine. Crucially, not only is it due to it has an impact on the global community and the views of other states, they both also have a lot of hard power to prevent interventions, which they've done due to their willingness to use UN Security Council vetoes to block resolutions that could authorize humanitarian action, especially when such interventions might challenge their own strategic interests or those of their allies. For example, Russia repeatedly vetoed resolutions aimed at addressing the crisis in Syria, shielding its ally Bashar al-Assad from international military responses, despite evidence of widespread human rights abuses. And this assertive use of veto power has created an environment where major humanitarian interventions are increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to pursue currently. Crucially, also impactful was the growing criticism of Western hypocrisy and selective interventionism. So the reputation of humanitarian interventions was quite strong in the 1990s, especially when, and the early 2000s, when you saw the development of the responsibility to protect doctrine. But this was really tarnished by the accusations of hypocrisy and selective application in the war on terror. So the fact that the US was itself using torture and human rights abuses against detainees at Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib prison. This exposed a double standard where the West was perceived as violating the very human rights it claimed to defend, eroding trust in its motivations for future interventions. Beyond the war on terror, criticism has grown over the West's failure to hold its allies accountable for recent human rights abuses as well. For example, the reputation of the US has been damaged by the Israel-Gaza war, where it's continued to arm and support Israel despite reports of significant human rights abuses and over 45,000 deaths in the last couple of years, the majority of whom have been civilians and many of whom were children. This has really weakened the moral authority of Western nations and the West, and the US in particular, to lead or support humanitarian interventions. The third key reason, though, is actually the US's growing isolationism itself and its lack of willingness to uphold human rights itself. So the United States have really increasingly rejected its role as the global police force and shifted instead towards isolationism, which began in the late 2000s and has continued in the 2010s and 2020s. The election of Obama in 2008 reflected growing public disillusionment with extensive military engagements abroad. So one of the perhaps most central reason why Obama beat Hillary Clinton in the primary and why he was able to win his first election as well was that he'd originally opposed the Iraq War, which was a view shared by a lot of the US population by that time. Of course, at the start, a lot of them supported the Iraq War. And he was elected on a program of decreasing the involvement of US troops abroad, even though he actually didn't make major progress on this as president. This then deepened under Trump in his first term, who advocated for an America First approach that prioritized domestic issues over international interventions. This marked a significant departure in the US historical role as the global enforcer of liberal democratic values in the post-Cold War period and human rights, and undermined this kind of impetus and support for humanitarian interventions domestically in the United States as well. This was then continued under Biden, though of course less strongly, with the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan in 2021. And it's very much going to continue in Trump's second term as well, I'm sure. And the shift towards a more inward-focused US foreign policy really left a vacuum in global leadership, contributing to the overall decline in these humanitarian interventions in the past 15 years. So, three key reasons: the clear hypocrisy of the United States due to the war on terror. For me, the most important is the growth in power of Russia and China, which not only oppose humanitarian interventions because they override state sovereignty, they also have the hard power and the vetoes in the UN Security Council to prevent them from happening. And third, the US is growing isolation as well. As a result, over the past 15 years, numerous human rights violations have occurred without international humanitarian intervention. While some maybe wouldn't have attracted intervention in the 1990s anyway, due to occurring in powerful states or those backed by major powers like Russia and China, others in weaker states might have previously led to interventions. So I include below a number of examples where major human rights violations have taken place without humanitarian intervention. You can use this as an example of the failure of humanitarian interventions to protect human rights in the past 15 years. First is that there's been a Uyghur genocide in China and Xinjiang in particular, where you've seen mass detentions of Uyghur Muslims with detention camps, forced labour, forced assimilation policies, and allegations of sterilisation. And despite global condemnation and sanctions, significant intervention has not been feasible due to China's apparent influence and the retraction from human rights humanitarian interventions. You see the Rohingya genocide. So in Myanmar, the Rohingya Muslim minority faced severe persecution, including mass killings, sexual violence, and forced displacement. The military crackdown in 2017 led to hundreds of thousands having to flee to Bangladesh. And whilst the International Court of Justice has taken up the case, as we looked at in the previous videos, substantial intervention has been absent. There's not been a humanitarian intervention. Crucially, during the Syrian civil war, there were a number of human rights violations, including the use of chemical weapons by Bashar al-Assad. But because he was backed by Russia, Russia used its veto in the UN Security Council to prevent any interventions to protect human rights. Following the US withdrawal in 2021, the Taliban has regained control, leading to severe restrictions on human rights, especially for women and girls. The absence of international action Crucially, I think in this case, really, obviously linked to the other factors as well, especially in the history of the last 25 years, due to the US growing isolationism, due to the failure of its intervention in the 2000s and 2010s. That's a key reason why there hasn't been humanitarian interventions there. You've seen human rights violations also in Iran, particularly with the kind of in response to protests. You've seen widespread state violence against civilians, particularly women. While these actions have drew global condemnation, comprehensive humanitarian intervention hasn't taken place, particularly only due to, I think this likely wouldn't have happened anyway, even in the 1990s, due to how close of an ally Iran is now with Russia and growing also with China. The Israel-Hamas conflict, so the Israel-Gaza war has led to over 45,000 Palestinian deaths at the hands of the Israeli military, the majority of which have been civilians, and despite international outcry by a lot of actors and citizens, substantial intervention has been limited due to the strong backing Israel receives from the United States, even during the 1990s. It's very unlikely there would have been humanitarian intervention there. Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to large-scale human rights abuses. And finally, you can actually point to Yemen and Sudan as well, where in both cases there have been significant human rights abuses and risk of mass starvation due to civil wars. And I think actually these two countries are ones where, if they'd occurred in the 1990s, there may have been international humanitarian intervention, but there hasn't been due to widespread violence over a significant period of time, particularly in Yemen. So there's some examples of human rights violations globally that have occurred in the last, or currently, or have occurred in the last 10 or so years. What we're going to have a look at now, trying to wrap up the bit on humanitarian interventions, is some key arguments that they do or that they don't promote human rights. So starting off with the arguments that they do promote human rights, the first is that humanitarian interventions are crucial to preventing the immediate human rights violations of citizens. So one of the most compelling arguments is that they're the only way to immediately prevent human rights violations, especially if they're committed by a state that has significant power. When that state is committing mass atrocities such as genocide, ethnic cleansing, or systemic violence, military intervention can be the only effective means to mitigate the suffering. And you see that, for example, in the NATO intervention in Kosovo in 1999. They really prevented and protected the Albanian population from massacres by Serbian forces. Similarly, the intervention in East Timor is a really good example of that. They really show how timely interventions are crucial to preserving lives and preventing further atrocities. Secondly, it can be argued that humanitarian interventions uphold human rights through the responsibility to protect doctrine and are an important deterrent. So the R2P and the fact that it's been formally endorsed by the United Nations represents a commitment, or did represent a commitment by the international community to uphold human rights and act when states fail to do so. Humanitarian interventions serve not only as a response mechanism, but also as a deterrent, and the existence of this principle signals to potential perpetrators, or did at the time, that the global community is prepared to intervene if large-scale human rights violations occur. And you could potentially use the NATO intervention in Libya as an example where the responsibility to protect was invoked, or it wasn't formally invoked, but it was used and it protected civilians from immediate human rights violations as a consequence. And finally, you can point to the fact that some humanitarian interventions have been successful in creating lasting peace and holding perpetrators accountable. For example, the intervention in Sierra Leone is a successful case where external military action, supported by broader peace efforts, upheld human rights in the long term, rather than just immediately, and failing to create long-term peace and stability, which often happens with interventions. It is crucial in disarming combatants and laying the groundwork for peace, and crucially, the fact that it was combined with a special court for Sierra Leone, which is an international tribunal, ensured that those responsible for war crimes were prosecuted, including Charles Taylor, who was later convicted. And this shows how well-executed humanitarian interventions can promote long-term stability, uphold justice, and demonstrate that violations of human rights will be met with consequences. On the other hand, then, we have some arguments that humanitarian interventions don't protect human rights. First of all, it's the argument that they undermine state sovereignty and risk any military intervention being justified on humanitarian grounds. They've arguably set a precedent that undermines the principle of state sovereignty, raising concerns about how these interventions might be used as a justification for military actions that are not genuinely aimed at protecting human rights. And you could potentially look at the Iraq War as an example of that. The concept of R2P, whilst noble in its intent, has contributed to this risk by codifying the idea that states lose certain sovereign protections and lose state sovereignty, which is central to the international community, when they fail to safeguard their citizens. And I said, and the Iraq War can be used as a good example of that. Second key argument is that humanitarian interventions have caused major civilian casualties in many cases and are selectively used by the West. So crucially, these interventions have been used by Western powers and often have actually led to these significant civilian casualties, which are crucially the exact opposite of what they're trying to do. And that's just because military interventions, even if they have humanitarian aims, inherently carry the risk of collateral damage. For example, the NATO intervention in Kosovo was aimed at protecting the ethnic Albanian population, but resulted in civilian casualties due to their airstrike campaign. And reports indicate that NATO bombings mistakenly targeted civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools. Additionally, the selective nature of Western-led interventions has fueled accusations of hypocrisy. So whilst interventions have taken place against weaker states that aren't US allies, they haven't taken place against US allies such as Israel or against major powers such as China and Russia. And the final key argument is that they actually often are unsuccessful in creating stability. While interventions might temporarily prevent immediate human rights violations, they often lack the planning and commitment needed for effective nation building and sustainable peace in the long term. You can see that from the Iraq War, where despite its partial justification on human rights grounds, it failed to create a stable and functioning state afterwards. And that can still be seen with a number of militias today and a power vacuum in Iraq today. And similarly, you can see with the Libya intervention in 2011, which had very similar consequences. And these both demonstrate that humanitarian interventions can worsen the humanitarian situation they actually intend to resolve. So that's some key arguments on the other side. Obviously, there are some other arguments as well. For example, you can actually look at, in the last 15 years, as how there's been a lack of humanitarian interventions. And you'll see I bring some of those in when you look at the essay plans as well. But these are specifically on humanitarian interventions themselves and some arguments on either side. The final thing we're going to have a look at, which is slightly linked, but just a final part of the human rights part of the specification, is the role of civil society in promoting human rights. And we'll look at a number of groups. The first of those is grassroots human rights movements, which have become powerful advocates for human rights, mobilizing communities and individuals directly affected by injustice. You can look at the Black Lives Matter movement, which has grown into international force from 2011, but particularly going into 2020 as well, for racial justice and against police brutality. And so in 2020, following the killing of George Floyd, BLM demonstrations mobilized over 20 million people in the US alone. But there were also protests held in over 60 countries, and that really shows how grassroots human rights movements can put pressure internationally on governments for change to better uphold human rights. And it prompted businesses and public institutions to address systemic racism. For example, $10 billion was made in corporate pledges towards racial equality causes in 2020. In 2024, you can see that civil society is mobilized once again in response to Israel's military actions in Gaza. So protests have erupted globally, with millions demonstrating in cities across Europe, North America, and the Middle East to denounce the high civilian death toll and call for immediate humanitarian aid access. Social media's played an important role, and these demonstrations have really intensified the public debate on the responsibility of governments to respond to alleged human rights abuses and led to growing calls for accountability, with several governments facing pressure, particularly Western governments, to reassess military aid policies and their strong ties to Israel. This really shows how grassroots movements continue to amplify human rights abuses and place them at the forefront of public consciousness, particularly when they have significant backing from the public in a number of countries. Other groups that do very similar things are human rights NGOs, such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the International Federation for Human Rights, which have played a key role in global human rights advocacy by documenting abuses and campaigning for policy changes. Amnesty International has been really important in using its network and its voice to highlight human rights abuses. It did so really impactfully and importantly in relation to Guantanamo Bay. And has consistently done so in relation to the US's human rights abuses, but has also in relation to other countries, such as its reports on forced labour in Xinjiang, which has drawn international attention and led to sanctions from the European Union and the United States, and there's a lot of investigative reporting in relation to that. Human Rights Watch has had a significant influence as well. For example, its focus on Rohingya abuses in Myanmar in the genocide, which played an important role in the ICJ taking up the case of genocide against Myanmar. Another key group that plays a role in the protection of human rights are foundations and philanthropists, which have also sought to promote human rights, funding initiatives that address systemic injustice and empowering grassroots organisations. The Open Society Foundation, for example, funded by George Soros, invested over $32 billion in human rights and social justice causes since it was founded. In Eastern Europe in particular, they focus on strengthening press freedom and providing legal support for asylum seekers. Whilst the Ford Foundation has committed also to substantial resources to human rights causes, including $1 billion in grants for initiatives on gender equality, economic justice, and civil rights across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. For example, it supported indigenous rights in the Amazon and empowered local communities to combat land grabs and environmental exploitation. So that just finally has a look at some non-state actors that play a role in protecting human rights. The vast majority of this video has looked at humanitarian interventions, some of the key arguments on either side, and crucially the fact that they've really decreased in the past 2 decades. So you can bring a lot of these arguments in this video, especially so you can bring some of the content into the 12 markers, looking at comparing them, some of the criticisms of both them and human rights courts. So similar criticisms, for example, in relation to sovereignty that you can bring in. You can also very much bring this into 30 markers. Some of these arguments on the effectiveness of humanitarian interventions, which could be a question in itself, or you could look at a comparison between humanitarian interventions and international courts. For example, there is an argument that humanitarian interventions are more powerful because they can override state sovereignty whilst human rights courts can't. But of course, we've got a number of arguments here why they're not successful as well. As I mentioned at the start of the video, all of the questions in bold, both the 30 markers and the 12 markers, can be purchased on the Politics Explained website. We've got detailed essay plans or 12 marker plans for them, which should really help you prepare for your exams. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you. And I'll see you in the next video.